All right. Hello, everyone. Happy Halloween, and welcome to another episode of Radical History. I'm your host, guide, instructor, friend, ally, all of the above, none. And today, I'm going to be talking about the political economy of witchcraft, which is to say that I'm going to be talking about witches and witchcraft, but I also want to talk about the legal and social, political, economic, cultural elements of witchcraft and witch trials. This title was already getting kind of long when I made it, so I want to also emphasize that this is going to range through a lot of European history, but it's going to end and focus on colonial witchcraft and sort of culminate in the Salem witch trials. So my focus is going to be largely on Puritan witchcraft, American witchcraft, but I'm going to talk about all sorts of things. Before I continue, I feel like I ought to give a few disclaimers, and in the form of just letting you know about how things are going to work and what I'm going to cover. Specifically, I want to say that this is not meant to reflect on or discuss or really even be relevant to modern day witchcraft, Wiccan, or pagan spiritual practices, and I'm going to discuss why specifically that is later, but this is not about, I guess, for lack of a better word, real witches. The people I'm discussing here were not witches for the most part and did not consider themselves to be witches. Some consider themselves to be witches. Some may have practiced a form of folk healing or midwifery, and maybe even some things that look kind of witchy to us. But they all consider themselves, for the most part, to be good Christian folk. So just that out of the way. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about the political economy of witchcraft, and I have a lot to say. So buckle up, happy Halloween, and let's get going. So let's begin with witchcraft in general, what it means, what we're discussing when we say witchcraft. So the legal and historical and sort of church definition of witchcraft is maleficium, which this is the Latin term for witchcraft, an act of witchcraft performed with the intention of causing damage or injury, or the resultant harm thereof. This could be, in certain time periods, kind of mundane. It could be poison or drugs or some other form of entirely ordinary behavior. It could also be sorcery, astrology, folk healing, being a midwife, or performing any sort of other medical function. It really varies wildly. There's not a good or consistent definition of witchcraft really at any point in time, and that's something that's worth remembering and considering. The Bible itself does not say a whole lot about witches. In fact, it says almost nothing. Exodus 22:18, you probably have heard, says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." But this is only in one translation, and it's really not clear about what it refers to, and there are other verses that other sections of the Bible that sort of obliquely reference this, but there's not really a lot about witchcraft or witches in the Bible, and it's kind of left to other future scholars and religious authorities to make their decisions about it. And originally, witchcraft is not a major concern of the church. I know that sometimes it can seem like perhaps witch burnings and witchcrafts, or I get the impression that this is the case. Witch burnings, witchcraft, witches in general are something that the church has always been concerned with, but this is not the case. The early church not only did not consider witchcraft to be a huge problem, many of the early church fathers considered it to be just a non-issue. Augustine considered witchcraft an impossibility. If all power comes from God, you cannot do miracles or magic or sorcery just because, unless it is coming from God, in which case it is holy and it's a miracle, and then it's not witchcraft. Later, the Canon Episcopi, which was a segment of medieval canon law dating to sometime around the 11th or 12th century, did have a little bit to say about witchcraft, and it said this: the bishops and their ministers should by all means make great effort so that they may thoroughly eradicate the pernicious art of divination and magic invented by the devil from their parishes, and if they find a man or woman adhering to such a crime, they should eject them turpidly dishonored from their parishes. Now, the position taken by the author of the Canon Episcopi is actually that witchcraft and these sort of devil-worshipping, demon power-acquiring actions did not exist, and they were deceptions, dreams, phantasms, that they were all in the imaginations of the people who were claiming to be witches, and so they should be thoroughly ignored. The belief in the reality of these deceptions is a heresy worthy of excommunication, but that's it. It is not suggesting that witchcraft is real. And this was church doctrine for the following 500 or 400 years, essentially. A more nuanced position is that the devil is real, but his only action or his only influence is creating delusions in the mind. The delusions do not have bodily reality. This is an important distinction for a long time. Essentially, it means that, to the extent that anyone in the church believes that witchcraft is real, the problem is mostly a mental one, and not that there are actual witches doing witchcraft that need to be burned or hanged or whatever. There's some development on this in the 13th and 14th century after the Cathar heresy and the publication of Aquinas' Summa Theologica, which can be seen as an argument for the reality of witchcraft. It discusses in detail divination and whether or not it is heretical. It is. Specifically divination through the invocation of demons. I don't know that Aquinas would have intended this, but this could be seen as an opening to justifying the existence of witchcraft as a real and functional mystical pursuit, I suppose. That is one argument that has been made. It is important to note that one of the things that starts to change in the middle or late Middle Ages and the medieval period is an evolving role of Satan, a growth from a minor figure in the Bible, which he is. He does not take up very much page space in the Bible, to a much, much more threatening figure. There are a number of things that have to do with this. Like I mentioned, the Cathar heresy, the persecution of the Knights Templar, other groups accused of heresy were associated with witchcraft, specifically sexual deviance, Satanism, and explicitly sexual relations with the devil. This is a core and critical element of witchcraft and witchcraft accusations going forward. The idea that you had sexual congress with the devil or a demon, both, and that this was a fundamental part of being a witch and doing witchcraft was some sort of sexual element. So it's hard to identify the first witch trial, but it may have been a woman named Alice Keitler in Ireland in 1324. They start to pick up in the 15th century, and they don't stop until well into the 17th. And there are more witch trials after that, but the core witch trial period when these take up, when most witches are found and accused and killed, is between about 1500 and 1700. Overall, and this is in Europe, between 40,000 and 60,000 people were killed as witches. 80 to 85% of them were women, and most of them, almost all of them, were poor. This is important, and I want you to remember this because it is relevant and distinct in some ways to what happens in the colonies. But in England, where there are substantial witch trials, and in Europe, most of the women who are killed as witches are poor. It is almost a truism that they are disenfranchised in one way or another. The real sort of, I guess, starting gun for the witch craze, as we're going to call it, is the publication of a book called the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487, or the Hammer of the Witches, which is a super rad sounding name, but a not so rad book. This was published by the Inquisitor Heinrich Institorius and Jacob Sprenger, who were two German pastors and inquisitors who put together this sort of treatise, instruction manual really, on witchcraft and how to pursue it. Prior to the publication of this book and prior to the 16th century in general, sorcery and witchcraft was not criminal. Sorry, it was criminal, but not necessarily heretical. It was a crime and it could be punished, but it was not a capital crime in every case. And there's a lot of things that the Malleus Maleficarum and related works do, but one of the things that it does that is worth noting is that it makes very explicit the relationship between witchcraft and being a woman. Explicitly stated in the Malleus Maleficarum is the idea that women become witches because they are born female, not male, and are dissatisfied with the natural inadequacies and limitations thereof, and then they want retribution and revenge to sell their souls to the devil. Sorry, that they're willing to because of how mad they are about being women. It is not that the societies of the late Middle Ages are not patriarchal and misogynist, but even for the time period, the Malleus Maleficarum is a explicitly and incredibly misogynistic document. And it's also worth noting that this was not adopted by the church. The Inquisition actually denied the Malleus Maleficarum and said that it was wrong in many ways. However, many secular authorities did take up this document and use it as a way of justifying and understanding their witch trials. Another author, Fray Martin de Castaneda, wrote Tratado de las Supersticiones y Hechicerias, another book on witches, where he wrote, because Christ did not permit women to administer his sacraments, they are given more authority than men in the administration of the devil's execrations. So it was becoming more and more well understood that, to church authorities and to others, that women were specifically perpetrators of witchcraft and vulnerable to the devil's influence. Because another part of Castaneda's writing, he wrote, because they more eagerly seek out the knowledge of hidden matters and want to be the first to know things, something their natural condition does not permit, was a reason for witchcraft. Institorius wrote in The Hammer of the Witches, nearly all the kingdoms of the world have been overthrown by women. There was a lot of talk of original sin, forbidden knowledge. There's a very interesting element of this, which you maybe have already heard of or are familiar with, but there was an idea that, there was witches' magic and men's medicine, right? And the rise of the medical profession sort of had to coincide with the suppression of folk remedies. This is something that Barbara Ehrenreich has written about extensively, and in a classic text from the 70s, several, discussed the specific class struggle element of this, that the Malleus Maleficarum made connections between midwives, wise women, and witches, and then these connections appear in the trial records from this period. And the Maleficarum, or the Malleus Maleficarum, takes pains to distinguish between the medical profession from which women were explicitly barred. They couldn't attend university, study, train, or receive any qualifications, and the demonic healing work and knowledge of lay women and midwives. No one, according to Institutors and Sprenger, does more harm to the Catholic Church than midwives. So Ehrenreich writes, it was a political struggle. Second, in that it was part of a class struggle. Women healers were people's doctors, and their medicine was part of people's subculture. To this very day, women's medical practice has thrived in the midst of rebellious lower-class movements, which have struggled to be free from the established authorities. It goes without saying that witchcraft, well, it should go without saying that witchcraft was explicitly tied to women's sexuality, and that the men in question were obsessed with it. Institutors and Sprenger wrote in the Malleus Maleficarum that all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. There was an idea that not only did the women necessarily need to have sexual congress with Satan, but that they craved it and enjoyed it thoroughly. This is a common and frequent element of witchcraft trials and witchcraft legal jurisprudence. In the at the turn of the 17th century, in 1604, a French jurist, Jean Bodin, wrote De la démonomanie des sorciers, of the demon mania of the sorcerers, which was another significant work on sorcery and witchcraft, where he elaborates on this concept of pact witchcraft based on a deal with the devil. So this is important. The key element of witchcraft that takes it from sort of a nuisance and a crime, but one that is not significantly different from theft or criminal mischief of a different sort, is the idea that it directly comes from a relationship to and a partnership with demons or with the devil himself. And what causes this change is largely the Malleus Maleficarum and works like it, and increasing tension between different social and political classes of people. And there's more on that later. And this becomes really distinct and interesting in colonial New England. So I've talked about the Puritans before, and about the settlement of the Americas, and about the colonies, and I would love to go into great detail about it, but just know that they brought, despite the fact that the Puritans, especially, who we'll be talking about in the most detail, represented a distinct break from the Church of England, they brought with them many, many, many assumptions about how things work, especially about how witchcraft worked. And so they are bringing with them these exact same ideas about Satan, about the relationship between women and witchcraft, about the weakness of women, about the inherent heresy of folk magic, about the distrust of folk magic and midwifery even. And this breeds with the delightful Puritan imagination in some very, very interesting and terrifying ways. So, without going into too much detail about what the Puritans believed, because I've talked about that elsewhere and it's not actually all that interesting, it's important to note that men and women were, according to Puritan doctrine, co-partners in grace, and in a sense, theoretically, spiritually equal, though they were deemed inferior in other ways. But again, according, theoretically, to Puritan doctrine, there was a spiritual equivalence. That being said, marriage, family, and procreation were critically important to the Puritan doctrine, which was related to, of course, the growth of the colony. So women were required to and expected to marry, have children, tend to their families, both for spiritual and entirely practical reasons. There was a rich tradition of writing and literacy among the Puritans, as I'm sure those of you who are familiar with sort of historiography and history in general are aware. This is why we talk so much about the Puritans and the Puritan colonies and about Massachusetts and about Plymouth Rock and all that, because there's just an awful lot that was written by the Puritans about it. And two men specifically were responsible for a lot of this: Increase and Cotton Mather, two early Puritan ministers who had a lot to say on witchcraft and actually all kinds of things. And both commented on or were even involved with the Salem witchcraft trials. Cotton Mather studied and observed the children of the Goodwin family in Boston, whose witchcraft trial in 1684 resulted in the execution of a woman named Goody Glover. And these guys, in my mind, are arch villains of American history. That they have blood on their hands, and this is not a opinion that I alone share. The historian Charles Wentworth Upham wrote, "They, Cotton and Increase Mather, are answerable more than almost any other men have been for the opinions of their time. It was indeed a superstitious age, but made much more so by their operations, influence, and writings, beginning with Increase Mather's movement at the Assembly of Ministers in 1681, and ending with Cotton Mather's dealings with the Goodwin children and the account thereof, which he printed and circulated far and wide. For this reason, then, in the first place, I hold those two men responsible for what is called Salem witchcraft." Cotton wrote, among other things, but specifically, "The malignant vapors and humors of our diseased bodies may be used by devils, thereinto insinuating as engine of the execution of their malice upon those bodies. And perhaps for this reason one sex may suffer more troubles of some kinds from the invisible world than the other, as well as for that reason for which the old serpent made where he did his first address." Again, blaming women very specifically for being vulnerable to Satan and witchcraft. This is also, it's worth mentioning, a time of incredible upheaval. This is following the English Civil War. The Glorious Revolution happens in 1688. There's the overthrow and restoration of the monarchy. Uncertainty in both England and the colonies. I didn't know this actually until very recently, but at least one battle of the English Civil War was fought in Maryland, and several other conflicts happened in the colonies. This is a time of great upheaval and a very, very tense and stressful and difficult time in the colonies, which is not to excuse anything that is about to happen, but might help provide some context for what is about to come. So, the women of the colonies came to the New World with the express intent of taking part in the project of creating God's kingdom and the city on the hill, though what this meant to various people varied. And sometimes the project of these women clashed with the explicit project of the Puritan patriarchal capital project, right? The orderly creation of a more perfect society. And one significant distinction, or one significant event in this conflict, is the Antinomian controversy, which had a lot of elements, and I actually probably will talk about this in great detail some other time, but an important part of it is that in the late 1630s, a woman named Anne Hutchison began hosting weekly meetings at her home for women who want to discuss the sermons of the preacher John Cotton. John Cotton taught what probably seems like a pretty minorly different version of the gospel, but it was different enough in some ways that it was considered radical. And Anne Hutchinson had heard him and started giving her own meetings and started providing her own explanations and elaborations. These meetings were so popular among women that she began organizing meetings for men and was soon hosting 60 or more people a week. They were there to inquire more seriously about the Lord Jesus Christ. And the key part of this controversy is that rather than good works, rather than effort and the the specific accomplishment of good deeds. It was an intuition of the spirit that would lead to one's election by God. And this is a minor distinction, but a distinction that is important in sort of Calvinist and certain mainline Protestant denominations, Presbyterians, like I was raised as. But this sort of de-emphasized, among other things, the need to participate in and throw your full weight behind the Puritan patriarchal project, and this caused a lot of consternation among the powers that be. Hutcheson was eventually tried for her heretical teachings in 1637 and condemned in both secular and religious courts. This is what the Reverend John Wilson had to say about her. For as much as you, Mrs. Hutcheson, have highly transgressed, and offended and troubled the church with your errors, and have drawn away many a poor soul, and have upheld your revelation, and for as much as you have made a lie, therefore, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, I do cast you out, and deliver you up to Satan, and account you from this time forth to be a heathen and a publican. I command you, in the name of Jesus Christ and his church, as a leper, to withdraw yourself out of the congregation. So Hutcheson was essentially banished from Massachusetts colony. She moved to Rhode Island and was unfortunately killed by a party of Siouanoy warriors in 1643 during a series of conflicts between the settlers and indigenous people of the area. Hutcheson was a fascinating person and a difficult woman, and she was deliberate in challenging the orthodoxy because she believed to have a better understanding of the teachings of the church and direct revelation to the insights of Jesus Christ. And many people found that compelling and interesting. And it was not exactly it wasn't a socialist ideology or an especially substantially, libertarian or teaching a more equal world, but it was more so than what the Puritan orthodoxy believed, and it was threatening in a lot of ways to the church, to the Puritan leaders especially. It's also worth noting that in the late 17th century, that the colonies were developing a much more equitable gender ratio. Rather than being populated by colonists, there had been enough generations of natural births that there were equal numbers of men and women. The wars with various indigenous peoples had caused the deaths of resulted in the deaths of many fighting age men, and women live longer, which meant that overall there was a more equitable gender ratio, but in many cases there were more women than men. And this is important for a number of reasons, but it has a lot to do, it has a substantial impact on inheritance, the balance of power, and the distribution of property. So now let us talk again about witches in New England specifically. So, as we all know, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, and as I've mentioned, most witches accused of witchcraft are poor in Europe, but something interesting and unique happens in the colonies. And again, I want to point out that implicit knowledge, this is something that the anthropologist Mary Douglas talks about, are truths that are so self-evident that they aren't even worth discussing. Colonists traveled to the New World carrying the idea of witchcraft with them. The idea that women are witches or women are more likely to be witches is just a core fundamental belief. But it merged with sort of New World circumstances to become something recognizable but different in a very interesting way. So in 1641, when the colonists first began establishing their legal code, the first capital crime punishable by death was idolatry. The second was witchcraft. And the Massachusetts body of laws reads, if any man or woman be a witch, that is, has or consults with a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death. A familiar spirit in this context is a small animal or spirit that comes and visits the witch, believed to be sent by or gifted by the devil, a key part of performing witchcraft. More on that later. In 1642, the following year, witchcraft became punishable by death in Connecticut colony. And in Hartford, Connecticut, in 1647, Alice Young became the first person to be tried and executed for witchcraft in America. This launches the witchcraft craze, as it were, which would see dozens executed over the next half century. Not much is known about Alice Young. The following year, Massachusetts executed their first witch, Margaret Jones, a midwife and lay healer. Now, a distinct element of witchcraft trials, especially in America, is the idea of outbreak cases, where rather than a single witch or a small number of witches being accused, there is a massive growth or a massive an outbreak of accusations of witches, of people being accused and tried. And the first of these is in Hartford, Connecticut in the 1650s. A young girl, Elizabeth Kelly, cries out the name of a neighbor, Goodwife Ayres, during her fits before dying. Ultimately, 15 people were accused and 4 were executed, 3 women and 1 man, before it was all over. This was a precursor to the Salem outbreak, which you are all likely familiar with. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the Salem outbreak because, well, you probably know about it, and there are a lot of better books, movies, podcasts, all sorts of things that talk about it. I could do a whole talk on just Salem alone. I actually really like the 1996 movie version of Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which takes a pretty distinct opinion about what happened at Salem, but I think it's a great depiction of it, and it covers the events pretty faithfully. It's if you want to experience the Salem witchcraft trials in a vaguely enjoyable way, I definitely say check that out. It's worth watching. Here's the long and short of it, is that in 1692, more than 200 people were accused, 19 of whom were found guilty and executed by hanging. 14 women and 5 men. Another man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death, crushed by stones for refusing to plead in one way or another, and at least 5 people died in jail. The first people were accused and arrested were young women. The progenitor of all of this was a West Indian slave named Tituba, who her ancestry and her background is unknown and hard to pin down, but it is probably and extremely likely that her race and difference had a lot to do with the belief that she was inculcating these women into witchcraft. This was far and away the most dramatic and most shocking outbreak of witchcraft in the Americas, in the American colonies, that is. And it was also so dramatic and bad and clearly a overreach by the authorities that immediately everybody who could distanced themselves from it, and there would be very few witchcraft trials throughout the remainder of the colonial period. This was really kind of the last gasp. And in Europe, many jurists and both secular and lay authorities had moved away from trying witchcraft for a number of reasons, largely because of the unpleasantness of it, but also because of it was increasingly becoming understood that it was very hard to prove possession, witchcraft, any of these sort of legalistic dimensions of finding someone guilty as a witch. And so Europe wasn't done killing witches, but it had largely moved away from them by this time period, and many people were shocked by what happened in Salem. And what happened in Salem is very, very interesting for a number of reasons. It's an outlier. It's a dramatic episode, and there are a lot of explanations for it. You know, things like mass hysteria, actual witchcraft. One thing that I've seen frequently is that the rye bread in Salem had become moldy and was producing a convulsive ergotism. That the fungus that grew in the bread was Claviceps purpurea, which is what LSD derives from. I think this is a entirely too clever explanation, and that it's something much, much simpler. You know, in societies that believe in witchcraft, it is entirely real and believable for people to be afflicted by witchcraft-induced harm. This doesn't make it real, or sorry, doesn't make it not real, or somehow a hysteria or a mental illness. The numerous anthropologists have written about how highly superstitious societies like Puritan New England can produce real physiological effects, and that we will probably never know exactly what happened in Salem to produce such a dramatic number of possessed and executions, whether or not everyone was swept up in a hysteria. Again, Arthur Miller's The Crucible has a pretty distinct point of view on this, which I find compelling, but is, there's other understandings. The historian, I'm blanking on her name, Carol Carlson, who wrote The Devil in the Shape of the Woman, which is a really, really good book, which I recommend that you read, where I drew most of this information from, writes that as the community looked on, the young women, the possessed, expressed what they otherwise could not, that the enormous pressure put upon them to accept a religiously based, male-centered social order was more than they could bear. There is, in my opinion, obviously a gender dimension, and frankly, I think the explanation that it was just incredibly stressful and difficult to live in 17th century New England is a good one. That's an entirely believable explanation for why things are the way that they are, why people ended up doing what they did, that the sheer insanity and pressure of it caused people to behave in ways that seem entirely bonkers to us. But I want to talk about some numbers. I want to dwell on some interesting things about colonial American witchcraft and how it manifested and what that means. So, as I have hammered home several times, witchcraft is a gendered crime. It is associated with almost exclusively women, and this is just as true in New England as it is everywhere else. Men who confessed to witchcraft outside of the Salem outbreak were punished, but most confessing women were taken at the... But the difference is that most confessing women were taken at their word and executed. Confessing men were rebuked as liars. The anthropologist Monica Hunter Wilson theorizes that witchcraft beliefs are the standardized nightmare of a group, and that the comparative analysis of such nightmares is the key to understanding that society. You can see here the numbers of men and women who are accused and executed, convicted in witchcraft cases in New England, and it paints a pretty clear picture, right? According to the historian Natalie Zeman Davis, New England's nightmare is women as willing agents of the Prince of Evil in his effort to topple the whole hierarchical system. This relates back to Anne Hutchinson, right? And women like her who were denounced either as witches or heretics for challenging the established order. And there's also some other elements to this. There's an age element. Key indicators in the accusations and executions of women had to do with whether or not they were over 40, whether they could bear children, right, which is a major role of women in Puritan society. And these women also tended to be more powerful, independent, that they tended to wield power to the extent that it was possible more effectively in Puritan society. Carlson writes that clashes of economic interests within families, as well as the larger community conflicts that intensified them, carried the greatest implications for witchcraft accusations, for they exposed the fear of independent women that lay at the heart of New England's nightmare, right? And here's the real kicker, and this is a conclusion that is now ancient, but every time I reread The Devil in the Shape of a Woman, every time I come back to these numbers, it is shocking to me, because there are multiple vectors of witchcraft accusations. They're gendered, they're economic, they're social, interpersonal, but the thing that ties almost every woman who is accused of being a witch together is that they stood to or had gained property or inheritance from a male relative. They're older, they're widows, and they had inherited money or wealth in one way or another. The woman, according to Carlson, the women who stood to benefit from these demographic accidents, in quotes, account for most of New England's female witches. However varied their backgrounds and economic positions, these women, and the reason why they inherited is because they lacked brothers or sons. According to Carlson, they stood in the way of the orderly transmission of property from one generation of males to another. And I think that this is the core thing to understand about the Salem witch trials, about American witchcraft, about New England witchcraft trials. And I want to be clear that I don't believe necessarily this was explicit in every case, or maybe even in any case, that it may have been simply that these women appeared frightening or threatening in a certain way, and so the first thing that a Puritan might think of is that they were a witch. But consciously or subconsciously, witches, in New England especially, represented a threat to the established order, to the orderly transmission of property, to the patriarchal system as it existed. And this is borne out in the data. The vast majority, as you can see here in this table, of women who were executed for being witchcraft or for being witches were women who lacked brothers or sons. And you will find in the trial records that they often had inherited wealth or stood to inherit wealth. And while this is not explicitly stated as a reason, you can read between the lines here and figure out what happened. It's fascinating to me to look at witchcraft as a legal and political and economic phenomenon for this reason, because it is like we mentioned before, this is the nightmare of New England society, right? The witch represents the most terrifying thing that could exist to Puritan society, to an individual Puritan, right? A woman with power, in this case specifically supernatural power, gifted by the devil, but power who stands independent, who is capable of fending for themselves and sort of implicitly and explicitly providing a challenge to the New England power structure. And like I said, I don't know how much of this is explicit. Some of it actually was, some of it was not so, but I think that, American history often has these moments where the subtext is just kind of like stripped away and it's all just sort of like right there in front of you. And America, the colonies, is an explicitly aggressively misogynistic, pro-private property rights type of place. And the one fascinating place where this is, again, subtext stripped away, made explicit, is in the prosecution and execution of witchcraft. And it's so interesting because it didn't always have to be this way. Many of the women who came to New England saw this as an opportunity to have more power, personally, politically, spiritually, for themselves, which they believed, I think, that their husbands and fathers and ministers shared. But when they started to try to express that power, to try to take a more substantial role in the deciding of the course of society, the result was a hysterical and horrific, violent backlash in the form of witch trials. So, whether they were actual or potential inheritors of property, they were healers, they were tavern keepers, merchants, most accused witches were women who symbolized obstacles to property, prosperity, and the correct order of things. So happy Halloween, everybody. Thank you for listening to me talk about witchcraft and witches, and I hope that you thought that this was interesting as I think it is. I will be back in a week or two with something new, something different. I hope you've enjoyed this spooky season of discussions. If you have any questions or thoughts or complaints or whatever, drop it in the comment section. Please hit the like button. Thank you for tuning in, and have a wonderful Halloween.